convictions, and we need to make negotiations persuasive to the other side by making equally clear that we're prepared to stay.
My role in this conference is sort of like Joel Grey in Cabaret, to jump in whenever I need to, and Susan Glasser is wonderful. I wanted just to say, as I neglected, I want to shower with thanks and praise Christine Fair, who's joining us from UC Berkeley. Christine is Assistant Professor at Center for Peace and Security Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, author of Drone Wars, the article very provocative and important that recently appeared in Foreign Policy. I've been advised by our tech people, Christine, that while you speak, which if Susan Glasser encourages you to do, while you're speaking, just turn down the volume and it will cut down the feedback on your own computer. But now I turn it back to Susan.
Do you want her to go now?
Yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah, Christine, we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well on what are actual realistic options for proceeding at this point. Can you hear us?
Yeah, actually, is the audio okay? Because I hear there's just a lot of static on my connection.
Can you turn down the volume?
I'm trying to do that now.
I should be able to do it here.
Is that better?
A little bit more. A little bit more. It might be us, so we're gonna work on it.
Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. I have this Jurassic netbook. I'm surprised it even works. It's a little better than a carrier pigeon.
Okay, we're good. We're good now.
Okay, so we're good now. So, I mean, obviously I've missed a good chunk of the portion because I was actually trying to sleep. So I have a little bit of concern that some of my points might be redundant. And I don't know the extent to which you guys had already spoken about the Pakistan issue, but this has been one of my longstanding critiques of expanding the counterinsurgency effort in Afghanistan has been because of the absolute impossibility of engaging Pakistan on this issue. In several conversations over the last few weeks surrounding the Raymond Davis issue and Pasha's visit, you once again hear this discussion of the so-called trust deficit. And I have always been critical of this construction. I remain so, because what strikes me is that this isn't a trust deficit. This is actually a certitude surplus. Right? Pakistanis understand that as we're trying to get an end state in Afghanistan figured out, that the space that we used to have to finagle important differences is really constricting. And so to put a fine point on that, our needs to go after the Haqqani network, obviously the Quetta Shora, which has now been relocated to Quram, Karachi, and elsewhere, and Pakistan's desire and indeed requirement to maintain these assets are really coming into sharp conflict. And over the last 10 years or so, what we've largely done is we've tried to finesse this. That yes, it's true that Pakistan and the United States, we have different strategic goals over some longer term time horizon, but on issues, for example, like Al-Qaeda, the Pakistanis are going to help us out. What has become increasingly clear over the last year or so is that Pakistan is trying to figure out a completely separate endgame in Afghanistan. Of course, they've always done this. But I think we would be behooved to try to understand what it is the Pakistanis are discerning, because I think it does reflect some of the conversations I picked up on the last 2 minutes of the previous speaker. I think was that Jim Dobbins?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. It sounded like you, but all I see is some dude in a purple tie and a beard sitting in front of me. So one thing I've noticed in my
no, she can't see us.
Sorry, dude. One thing that I've noticed in the last year or so of my several trips to Pakistan is that the Pakistanis themselves are very worried about the remnants of the so-called Afghan Taliban, right? So one of the consequences of U.S. and NATO successful efforts at eliminating these different levels of leadership is that they've had to be replaced very quickly. And the people that are coming in to fill those billets hate the ISI, quite frankly, as much as they hate us. They have a different relationship with the ISI than the Al-Qaeda commanders of 10 years ago. They see Pakistan's role in Afghanistan as being manipulative, serving Pakistan's interests, but not that of Afghans. And so the Pakistanis themselves are trying to figure out, how do we regain the momentum not the momentum, how do we regain control over this organization that has really evolved over the last 10 years, right? It's not the same organization that it was 10 years ago. So the very fact that Pakistan itself is scrambling to figure out its own end state about this organization, does strongly suggest that our strategies about thinking about the Taliban really need to change. And I think fundamentally, one of my biggest concerns about the expansion of the counterinsurgency effort really goes back to Pakistan, right? The more troops that we need to have on the ground there means that we're ever more dependent upon Pakistan, not less. And so these differences that were significant, but somehow finessable over the last 10 years have become much more difficult to finesse. And I'd like to add that, of course, it's no longer just issues around Al-Qaeda and the Taliban that we're very concerned about with Pakistan. We're also very concerned about Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? I mean, I don't know how much you guys have talked about the multiple security concerns that we have situated there in Pakistan, but there is this enormous irony from my point of view that we've chosen a strategy that says we need to stabilize Afghanistan so we can stabilize Pakistan, but in fact, it's just the opposite. Whatever happens in Afghanistan is going to be to a very significant degree overdetermined by Pakistan itself. Right? That's my view. If you were to put your Pakistani goggles on for a second, since 9/11, its security equities have compromised more than they have been buttressed. So, for example, under the U.S. security umbrella, the Indians have been able to develop a presence in Afghanistan that they weren't able to develop before we were there. And so this gives rise to some, I think, a difference between what the Pakistanis say publicly and what they actually say privately. I know Kiani has said repeatedly, we need to have reassurance that you're going to be in Afghanistan in perpetuity. The White House somehow believes that by saying in Afghanistan, we're going to reassure the Pakistanis. It's actually just the opposite. I've been working with the Pakistan Army for a very long time now and spent quite a bit of time with a lot of them over the summer. I'm going back this summer. What's absolutely clear is that no matter what Kiani says, this is the way that many of the people that I've interacted with, including folks at the major level, they want us out. And they want us out for the reason that I just said. The longer we stay, the longer the Indians can basically free ride under our security umbrella, when in fact they simply want the Indians gone. So I see a huge number of discontinuities between our goals in Afghanistan and what we can accomplish when we consider what we're able to do with the Pakistanis. And I think at some point this last decade, wishful thinking about how we can bring the Pakistanis on board to get them to Seth Jones and I, a bunch of us have worked on how do you fundamentally reshape Pakistan's cost-benefit calculus around its current programs. And the approach the U.S. has adopted thus far, which is really about financial allurements, strategic conventional weapon systems, none of these things are adequate to convince Pakistan that its current approach is anything but helpful. So at what point do we really have to reconsider what we want to do and what we can do in Afghanistan when we have a more realistic understanding of what Pakistan is and will be, rather than the Pakistan that we aspire or hope to obtain through these various allurements? And so, going back to the theme of this, I've actually been a fairly strong proponent of this thing. I mean, a number of people have put it forward, Vice President Biden. I think there's a lot of merits to the counterterrorism plus notion. And I apologize, I didn't hear all of Dobbin's critique of it. But let me put out on the table why I think there's some advantages to this, although in some sense this train sailed, where we are where we are. By having a more easily sustainable footprint in Afghanistan, where we're not completely dependent upon Pakistan for the GLOCs, we're able to create a space where we can play more, we can play a harder ball game with Pakistan than we can right now. I'm not convinced that we cannot continue to go after Al-Qaeda without our counterinsurgency footprint for the following reasons. And we know that what's going on right now is a negotiation about a SOFA, a status of forces agreement. Karzai has no interest, and I can't imagine, let's start from a fundamental assumption. I think it's a low probability event, given even the abysmal operational capacity of the ANSF, that a return to the Taliban central government is even realistic. I take this off the table. So if there's a genuine possibility of the Taliban coming back, then my analysis it is absolutely pointless. So I'm going to take as a given that we're not going to have, Taliban 10.0, running the country from Kabul. So if we put that extreme outcome on the table, this is what I think could possibly work. Karzai has no interest in Al Qaeda coming back, and this we have fairly tightly aligned set of interest, right? So we negotiate through the process of the SOFA access to a number of important military bases from which we can continue to prosecute the counterterrorism mission, focusing on Al Qaeda. Now, I don't know, how much you guys talked about this before, but I am very strongly of the view that no matter how horrible the Taliban are, there is such enormous variation in the Taliban that it's very hard for me to say that the Taliban are any worse than some of the savages that we've made as our allies. So I find the moral arguments against the Taliban to be thoroughly unconvincing. And given that so many Afghans are opposed to the counterinsurgency, I'm also not convinced that once or if we were to scale back the counterinsurgency footprint, that our intelligence doesn't actually improve. So one of the arguments for maintaining the status quo or even escalating the counterinsurgency footprint is the quality of intelligence. I think it's a fairly specious argument to say that through our current operations we're getting, excessively high quality intelligence. I'm not persuaded by that. So, just sort of in conclusion, in making the defense for the counterterrorism plus, by getting out of a footprint that Afghans themselves seem to find so odious, and finding some midpoint of tolerance with the Taliban, I think it's entirely possible that our intelligence on Al Qaeda actually improves. And just in closing, I think realigning what our priorities in Afghanistan that focuses on Al Qaeda, not the Taliban, not only allows us to be in a less intense confrontation with Pakistan so that we can pursue our other objectives, which I think are far more important in Pakistan, frankly, than they are in Afghanistan. But ultimately, this becomes much more finessable in terms of money, lives, and the sorts of things that populations in Afghanistan, the United States, and Pakistan are willing to tolerate.
Christine, thank you so much. I know we can't see you, but we are very grateful for your provocative comments, and in fact, I'm hoping we can get as quickly as possible to a conversation among this great group. I'm going to ask Brian to go next, and actually, Brian, if you could talk from the podium, I think that will be better for our C-SPAN viewers.
Great.
But if we can keep it tight, we'll have more time to debate and discuss as well as get your questions.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Stephen, and everybody who's come here today, because I think this is a very important event. The first panel, I think, really punched above its weight. It had a lot of expertise, but it, I think, offered new ideas about how we can address this challenge. And what Joshua Faust called the malarkey of tragic horses. I see it as a classic Humpty Dumpty problem, and I was thinking about this event this morning and thinking about all of the think tank reports that came out last fall, in particular, including my organizations, the Center for New American Security, a bipartisan commission on the Council on Foreign Relations task force, New America's Afghanistan Study Group, and other. If you look at the broad contours of what's proposed in there's a lot that's quite similar amongst those recommendations, and a lot that's not new. And what I hope this conversation, I think, does is pushes us forward in this policy challenge that I think this administration is wrestling with. But it's clear to me at this stage, nearly 10 years into this war, we still lack a coherent strategy. We still lack a coherent strategy that sticks together. And I was thinking about this, and why is this the case? And at the risk of being pedantic before I get to the where do we go from here, I think it's important, and I do this a lot in meetings in the government too. What is a strategy? It includes a statement of objectives and desired ends. Those ends need to be realistic and achievable and well-defined. There needs to be ways and means designed to achieve those ends. They need to be prioritized in importance. And the roles and responsibilities of key players in executing those ways and means must be clearly defined. That's a very basic, I think, definition that we often miss inside of government and also in the think tank community, where we have the luxury of thinking about things as opposed to doing and clearing the inbox of those inside the government. I think there are three main reasons as to why 10 years into a war we still lack a strategy. This is very basic, but I think it's important to think about and maybe provoke new thinking on this. Number one, there's a multiplicity of actors that have a stake in the outcome. Christine's comments just talked about this, looking at it from the Pakistani perspective as opposed to ours. But number one, there's a number of different actors that have different interests, and we need to digest that here inside the Beltway, understand that, yes, our interests matter, have a clearly defined goal for those to advance those interests, but others are operating in that way. We quite often don't do that. We quite often don't map out what are the strategic interests of other actors. We often don't know in some cases because of the opaqueness of this. Number two, there's a wide range of complicated actions that each of these actors are undertaking. So to assess what's going on, I think you get a sense of complexity. And you understand why we're in somewhat of a quagmire. Number three, and I think this is important for the DC discussion, there is a considerable gap between America's impression of itself and our capacity to achieve stated outcomes. And it's not only in Afghanistan or Pakistan. I work on the Middle East also, and nearly for the last decade or so, we have had presidents of the United States, President Bush and now President Obama, declare certain outcomes they want to achieve, and then we don't achieve them. And it has created what I call an efficacy crisis. And this debate about the decline of American power, which I don't completely accept, because I actually think there's something deeper going on. I think that the nature of power in the international arena is actually changing. What it means to actually get what you want done, and that there's a multiplicity of actors that can shape that. And people have written about this more theoretically. That said, what do we do on Afghanistan? 6 quick things, and I'm going to go through very quickly, I hope. Number one, I actually think we need to continue to question counterinsurgency doctrine, which has continued to dominate a lot of our decisions. We did this yesterday in a great discussion with John Noggle at CNAS over at the Center for American Progress yesterday. It's my view that the doctrine has important elements and principles that can be applied in certain situations, but we need to stop thinking about it like a strategy. And I know I'm going to get tweets and angry blogs just for stating this, because it's almost become like a dogma. And if you question it, it's really, you're like questioning a religion. But the long war, as it's called, and counterinsurgency aspires to be like containment and deterrence was in the Cold War. It cannot be thus, because the seeds of a counterinsurgency strategy applied globally are it destroys itself, essentially. It is not sustainable for a number of reasons. Number one, large number of troops are not cost effective. Richard talked about that before. Number two, the presence of foreign troops quite often creates security challenges that didn't exist before. It inflames local populations. Number three, I think we see this, there's a potential legitimacy crisis of political actors that we seek to support in counterinsurgency strategies. And then number four, this is the thing that concerns me the most, it erodes potentially U.S. will to project its power in the world in different ways. That I believe we need to be a global leader, but I think we're eroding the political will on Capitol Hill to use resources to remain a global power. So number one, we need to question that. Number two, I think we need to have a goal, a clearly defined goal. Disrupt, dismantle, defeat Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan is the goal as articulated by the president. That is fine as far as it goes in terms of trying to marshal public domestic political support. But I think it also doesn't get us to much clarity in terms of what we're trying to build and achieve on the ground. I state the goal often as a stable and peaceful region of the world, South Asia, that is much more integrated with itself and economically, politically, culturally. You need to have a broad goal like that and state it proactively, as opposed to in the negative, which our current goal is to disrupt, dismantle, defeat Al-Qaeda without defining what are the conditions that we need to get there. Two, I think we need to identify that which we're going to do and that which what we're not going to do. We need to check our American exceptionalism at the door, in a sense. And this is going to be the hardest thing to do. And I'm trying to be a little bit provocative here, but we can't do it all. That runs against the grain of American culture, but we simply cannot do that a lot of things. And we're going to keep running in circles, I think, in Afghanistan if we don't recognize that. The last three things. We need to identify not only the interests of actors, but what they can do and what they're already doing. I think James in the last panel talked about statecraft. There are many faces here who have decades of experience who are engaged in statecraft and understand this. Ambassador Dobbins, Ambassador Pickering, who was here before. Understanding what I've talked about and Steve mentioned, that getting others to paint the fence for you getting others to pull their weight, understanding what their interests and what they're doing right now to achieve that which you want to achieve. Because right now, it's all about us, and a good bit of it, we're bearing the burden, and I don't think we fully understand how to disentangle ourselves. Number 5, we need to identify multiple means to achieve those goals, and not simply be focused on troop levels. And again, we're going to go into another round of debate here. And I'm sure it's going to be about the slope of the pace of withdrawal of U.S. troops. That's an important debate. But the thing that frustrated me in the fall of '09 when I came back from Afghanistan is that there was insufficient debate about the political and economic means that are available, not only to the United States, but to other countries. People haven't noticed the Defense Authorization Act, Ike Skelton, 2011. Not many people have noticed this, even in the policy discussion. It actually requires the President of the United States and the Pentagon and the State Department to produce a viable economic plan for Afghanistan that is sustainable. We in the think tank, I was doing a poll of think tankers. They don't know, a lot of people don't know that. People on the inside need help with that. This is one of the most. And then lastly, I think we need, this is probably the most controversial thing, we probably need a healthy dose of strategic ambiguity and flexibility in our own policy. This is anathema, I think, to a lot of people who want certainty. They want a deadline to get out, or they want to stay indefinitely in a long-term agreement. And here I'll only highlight 2 very specific things. Christine briefly mentioned this. I think it's quite foolish at this point for President Karzai to have the impression that we need a strategic framework agreement, strategic partnership agreement, more than he needs it. And I think that's the impression that our current action is leaving right now. With all due respect to President Karzai and his government, he is the leader of a relatively weak, poor, and corrupt government, and he has run circles around us for 5 or 6 years. And we've allowed him to do that, our own actions, our own sort of American exceptionalism, we've got to get it right, the sunk costs, yada, yada, yada. Number 2, on Pakistan. What was the phrase? The certitude surplus. That's brilliant, Christine. It's really, really important. I think at a certain point, there is a great deal of utility in having a strategy that has some elements of strategic ambiguity, that leaves some questions in the minds, because oftentimes our debate in the Beltway is, how do we reassure everybody? How do we reassure everybody that we're going to be with them in the long run? And what I'm saying is that we've got a considerable amount of power that is, in a way, like judo or jiu-jitsu, used against us, like the weapons, the resources that we're using to try to achieve certain ends, because we are so bullish about trying to get to where we want to go without thinking about what others can do to paint the fence for us. So I know I went over, but I hope that sparks some new thinking. I have some specifics in the questions and answers, but I look forward to the other respondents on the panel. Thank you.
Excellent. Brian, thanks so much. I can see by the end of this, we're going to have to be taking a vote here on counterinsurgency and whether it's actually a religion or not. Peter, I think we're very much looking forward to your sense in injecting also a little bit of your thoughts about what's really realistic in terms of what we're talking about here, in terms of the U.S. military's footprint in Afghanistan. Is it going to be changing in the foreseeable future? How much of this is continuing a conversation that we've actually been having for quite some time?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Steve Clemens, and for the invitation and to be on this great panel. Just a few factual points about some things that have been said earlier today. In terms of a cost-benefit ratio, at the height of the Vietnam War, the United States spent 9.5% of its GDP on the military. Right now, we're spending 1% of our GDP in Afghanistan. So we weren't attacked from Vietnam. We were attacked from Afghanistan. I think the money's worth it. And of course, the money will go down as we draw down. In a $15 trillion economy, $118 billion or whatever it is a serious amount of money, but it's not really a game changer in terms of our debt and other issues. In terms of painting the fence that Brian mentioned, there are 46 countries in Afghanistan as part of a coalition. And in fact, British and Canadian and Danish troops have died at a proportionately higher rate if you adjust for population than for Americans. I wanted to sort of attach myself to many of the points that Jim Dobbins made in terms of the data, and there's one data point that I'd like to add to that, which is you're more likely to be murdered in Washington, D.C. today than you are to be killed in the Afghan war. The war in Afghanistan simply isn't that violent, certainly by Afghan historical standards, and by absolute standards. You're 6 times more likely to be killed in New Orleans murdered in New Orleans today than you are to be killed in the war in Afghanistan, where 2,800 civilians died last year. But it's when you adjust it for population, you're still, as Jim mentioned, more likely to be killed in Iraq. And one final point on the counterterrorism coin debate. We've already tried the counterterrorism approach, and it was found wanting. And the whole point about where we are today is we did this whole exercise on the cheap. As Jim Dobbins and others at RAND pointed out, in the first years of the Afghan project, we spent roughly a 30th of what we spent in Bosnia after the conflict there per capita, and a 30th of what we spent in Kosovo. So, we did it on the cheap, and that's why we're here today having this conversation. Why are we there is an interesting question. I think the President has made a mistake, a very understandable one, about narrowly defining it just about al-Qaeda, which of course, from a political view, makes a lot of sense, because which American wants al-Qaeda to be back in Afghanistan? The answer is none. But there are some other reasons, one of which is a very unrealistic one in foreign policy terms, which I think, and many Afghans think, that we have sort of a moral obligation to get it right in Afghanistan, by right, a somewhat stable state, a somewhat okay army, before we leave. And I think that's a reasonable thing for us to consider now that we've overthrown their government. And it's not just al-Qaeda we need to be concerned about. When Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban, every Muslim insurgent terrorist group in the world was either headquartered there or had a significant presence there. So just to define it merely as al-Qaeda is not enough. And then, as Brian pointed out, a stable South Asia is surely a part of this picture. And finally, the Taliban are the Taliban. The idea that somehow these are going to turn into sort of a group of Henry Kissingers over time, I think is just ludicrous. We've run a controlled experiment on this issue for years in Pakistan. In Pakistan, in Swat, just 2 years ago, they beheaded the policeman, they burned down the girls' schools, they imposed a reign of terror. That's the Taliban. The Taliban don't recognize the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Haqqani network today is hosting not just al-Qaeda, but Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, the Islamic Jihad Union. I can give you a whole multiple set of three-letter jihadist groups that are now located inside the Haqqani network. This is who they are. And what are they doing in Afghanistan? As Jim mentioned, 2,800 civilians were killed last year, 75% by the Taliban. There's been a consistent campaign, by the way, not very well covered in the American press, in my view, of chemical weapons attacks against girls' schools, which have happened all over the country in Afghanistan, more than a dozen cases. So that is the Taliban. That said, of course, we do want to reconcile with people, even people we find to be morally objectionable in one way or another. But there are several problems with reconciliation. I just want to tick off very rapidly. One is we're 10 years into this. The moderate Taliban have already reconciled. The people we keep talking about, Mullah Zaif, Mutawakil, all these people, they're not part of the Taliban that we're fighting. They're already reconciled. Secondly, Mullah Omar is a religious fanatic, and the history of successful negotiations with religious fanatics is not encouraging. He calls himself the commander of the faithful, which is a rarely invoked religious title, indicating that he's not just the leader of the Taliban, but the leader of all Muslims. This is not somebody that I think you can easily do business with, and he's taken every opportunity to say that he's not interested in negotiation or compromise. They've had 10 years to reject al-Qaeda and all this works. It's never happened. They could or say 9/11 was a mistake, or this guy bin Laden was bad for us, or whatever. They've said nothing like this. The history of peace deals with the Taliban is not encouraging. We've had multiple peace deals with them in Pakistan, in Waziristan in 05 and 06, in Swat in 09. They reneged on every peace deal, and they took it as an opportunity to regroup and grab more territory. Mullah Bareda and his seizure by the Pakistanis indicates the Pakistanis have a veto over these negotiations. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They have legitimate interest in Afghanistan. But this is not a typical negotiation where we have governments and insurgents. We also have now Pakistan sitting at the table. And of course, we also have now the Northern Alliance sitting at the table. Two of the most powerful men in Afghanistan spent years fighting the Taliban. Bismillah Khan, the head of the Ministry of Interior, Dr. Abdullah, who is very likely at this moment to be the next president of Afghanistan. Do you think they want to deal with a Taliban that gives them significant territory or compromises on significant principles? The answer is, of course, no. We've seen the negotiations in Mecca and Maldives have basically been performance art operations that have achieved absolutely nothing. We saw with the debacle with Mullah Mansour, the supposed leader of the Taliban, who was negotiating directly with the Karzai government, who turned out to be quite a shopkeeper, making quite a lot of money based on his being an imposter, that we're very foggy about who we're dealing with. We just simply don't know. Finally, and this is really the nub of it, what do the Taliban want? And the insurgencies, this is a very common problem. The insurgents know what they don't want. They want the international forces out. But what vision of Afghanistan do they really see? Does it include democracy? Does it include elections? Does it include women working? Does it include girls going to school? I think you actually know the answer to most of those questions. And the answer is no, that is not what it includes. And they've never made that clear because it would be a problem for them, I think, in terms of these negotiations. That said, negotiations are the way forward, of course, and they have multiple potential advantages. One is, of course, you create splits in the insurgency. So Hezbollah Islami might do a deal, for instance. They're the lowest hanging fruit. That's a good thing because it shows the Taliban are not united. It sows dissension in the ranks of the Taliban. That's a good thing. It provides information about this very opaque movement. That's a good thing. And as finally, as Jim said, it allows it takes away the moral high ground from the Taliban. They're not involved in a holy war. They're actually involved in a political process, and they may become more sort of responsible. And my final point on this is Audrey Cronin has done some very interesting work about what are the preconditions for insurgents or terrorists to come to a peace deal. And I'm just going to give you 4 of them and think about how they operate in Afghanistan going forward. One is a mutual recognition of a military stalemate. This is a very common. Now, if we'd had this conversation a year ago, I would have said that wasn't looking very good. But actually now it's a little bit better. The Taliban have had some military defeats in Kandahar and Helmand. American and Western publics are fed up with this war that are already the longest in American history. So maybe there is a mutual recognition of some form of stalemate. Strong leadership on both sides of the equation. Mullah Omar and Hamid Karzai don't fit either of these. Mullah Omar is in control of even the insurgency in southern Afghanistan. So that's a negative. Trusted third-party sponsors are quite important. Here, the Saudis initially were involved, but I think for them, after all, what is al-Qaeda's principal goal? It's the overthrow of the Saudi monarchy. So if the Taliban don't reject al-Qaeda and all its works, the Saudis are not going to be involved further. The Pakistanis are not trusted by any party. As Christine said, they're not even trusted by the Taliban. And so that's a problem. The United Nations might be a venue, and of course, Tom Pickering was here earlier, and Jim worked on the task force, and the task force suggested the UN might be a good way of going forward, and it might be. However, a big caveat, the Taliban have attacked a number of UN officers and personnel in the last year, suggesting that they may not share the same view. Finally, the Turkey office opening sounds like a good thing on that level. And just one final point, ending on a slightly more optimistic note, the political context is very important. 74% of Afghans are in favor of negotiations. That number goes up to 94% in Kandahar. So there is a great, even though only less than 1 in 10 Afghans have a favorable view of the Taliban, there is a great political appetite to do a deal with them, and that is really the main optimistic thing I can say on this issue.
Matthew?
Okay, well, thank you for everyone for coming today, particularly on short notice. If you work with Steve, you learn to take a breath, and it's going to work out. So I appreciate everyone coming. And you know, being the 10th of 10 panelists, you know, you end up just constantly changing your notes to try and keep up with everyone. And I think it's been a great morning so far. Just to respond back to a couple of Peter's points real quick. You know, the issue of GDP and how much we're spending. It's true in terms of how much of GDP we spend on our military, but if you look overall at our government spending, this comes to an issue of priorities for us. We're spending so much more on our military than everything else. I think Ezra Klein from the Washington Post had that great comment last week or 2 weeks ago where he said the U.S. government is turning into an insurance company with an army. So it's a question of not necessarily, you know, apples to apples here, but a general question of what are our priorities, okay? If we're willing to spend you know, to build an Afghan security force of 400,000 in Afghanistan, but we're cutting cops in nearly every municipality across the United States. It's a question of priorities. With regards to both Ambassador Dobbins' comments and Peter's about the relationship between al-Qaeda and Taliban, which tends to be the issue that folks on Capitol Hill have when it comes to doing something different in Afghanistan, I think that relationship is pretty nebulous. Who was the guy who brought bin Laden to Afghanistan in the first place? A guy named Abdul Saif. Who's Abdul Saif? He was the guy that Karzai wanted to be Speaker of the Parliament. So this notion that there's some clear connection between the entire insurgency and al-Qaeda is just, it's not the case. And while there are elements of the Taliban that are connected with al-Qaeda, why do we lump it all together? And this brings me really to my first point about where we're at right now. And we're in a stalemate. And the metrics, the indicators, the cell phones, the number of schools open, et cetera, I don't doubt that. The public opinion numbers, do not doubt that at all. Because it reminds me so much of Iraq in 2004, 2005, 2006. When I was in Iraq in 2004, 2005, in Tikrit, mortar and rocket daily, IEDs all over the place, small arms ambushes. Half day's drive, I can go to Sulaymaniyah, though, in Kurdistan, eat in a restaurant, sleep in a hotel. You know what I mean? So there's different metrics, different indicators for different parts of the country, and you have to understand the conflict in that way. Additionally, when I came home, worked on the Iraq desk at State, same thing too. Every week I worked on what's called the weekly status report. Put out information that shows we're winning. And then I worked on what's called the National Strategy for Victory in Iraq. Not the same wording, but very similar language to what we're using right now in Afghanistan. So when you look at what are the actual key metrics, the key data points, the actual indicators of conflict, size of the insurgency. And one of the things that we should be careful of is rather than using Taliban, use the word insurgency, because when we say Taliban, we lump them all together under that white banner, which is not entirely appropriate, or not appropriate at all in many cases. So when you look at the key size of insurgency, political support for the Karzai government, 10 million people voted in the first election, 3 million people voted in this last election. You look at IEDs, assassinations, number of Southerners joining the Afghan National Army. Last numbers coming out of our government, 0.6% of Afghan Army recruits were Southern Pashtuns. Okay, you have a very serious problem there. And then American casualties. We've had 21 killed this month. We only had 20 killed previous April, which is higher than the previous April, et cetera. All the trends are going the wrong way. So I don't see the evidence to support progress, and again, it reminds me of the statements we made in 04, 05, 06. So the Afghans have our recommendations on where we should go. It's in the handout we provide here as well as online. But I also encourage you all to read the Century Foundation's report as well as Brian's organization's report from Center for American Progress. CNAS has done reports, CFR has done reports, and you'll see that most people out there are advocating for a change. Okay? And one of the things I just want to discuss briefly, let's talk about the one aspect that we recommend in terms of political efforts and reconciliation. And when we say political efforts, you can't walk into somebody in this town who doesn't say it's a political solution to this conflict, but we're not doing it. Okay, so we actually have to change our policies. When I was there and we received our operational order from General McChrystal, there was nothing in there instructing us to do political efforts. There's nothing in there saying, speak to the insurgency and find out what their grievances are. Find out why these people who weren't supporting the insurgency last year are now supporting the insurgency this year. Until we do those kinds of things, we won't have any success at negotiations. And negotiations have to occur at that local level, so you have to have your battalion commanders and your brigade commanders doing those things, but needs to occur at regional and national levels as well. And then, of course, ultimately, some type of international settlement with regards to Afghanistan that guarantees its neutrality. But the other aspect of this is that we have to push for political reforms. Okay, if we look at Afghanistan 2001 as a civil war that we intervened in and took one side out of power and put the other side in power, but then imposed a political system that just reinforced victory for one side, we have to amend that. And the problem is in Afghanistan, there's not just two sides in this conflict. There's probably about 100, 1,000. It's very, very difficult, extremely multi-layered, extremely complex. So if you look at the fact that the process we have now marginalizes and disenfranchises many elements of Afghan society and pushes them to insurgency, just in many ways our policies in Iraq did by marginalizing and disenfranchising the Sunnis and pushing them to the Sunni insurgency, we realize that what we've been doing is giving the Afghans two choices, and they're both bad choices. You can either support the Taliban, or you can support this Karzai government made up of your traditional rivals that is corrupt, predatory, and illegitimate. And so they're both very bad choices. So until we have a policy that recognizes that right now we're acting as a belligerent in the conflict, we're just participating in the conflict, we're taking one side, we're stuck in whether it's the conflict is on ethnic, regional, economic, whether it's basically between the Hatfields and McCoys, and we're propping up and making the Hatfields rich, at the expense of the McCoys. Until we recognize that and amend our policy to actually be more in a role of being an arbitrator or a mediator, this conflict will continue to be in a stalemate. Because when you go and you meet with the rural Pashtuns who are supporting the Taliban, they look at you and they talk to you, and we've been fighting for 30 years. We're tired, but we're not going to surrender. And who am I standing with when they say that to you? And this happened both in the East and South. You're standing with a Tajik who fought for the communists. In the South, I was standing with a Pashtun intelligence officer who had been part of CAD, the Afghan intelligence service. I mean, so you're standing up there with these people's traditional rivals, and you're saying, this is your government, embrace it. So until we recognize what we're doing and what role we're playing in the conflict, and then seek to amend that process to be one, again, of an arbiter or a mediator, we won't see that necessary negotiations that leads to stability, not just in Afghanistan, but ultimately in Pakistan. But I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for coming. I look forward to the conversation.
Matthew, thank you so much. I think in a lot of ways you sort of crystallized the conversation that we can be having, because one of the things I'd like to throw back at our panelists, including Christine, is what you left us with, which is there a consensus on this group that a policy change is what we're talking about on the part of the United States in order to get to a state of political settlement or political negotiations? Are we actually talking about reopening the Washington policy debate? And Brian, I want to come to you on that one, for example. Clearly, you have a point of view on counterinsurgency. Is that actually stopping us from political negotiations?
Well, first, I don't know if the mic's working. There we go. First, I would say that we are moving through a period of change in policy no matter what. I mean, and the president has defined it as such, that July 2011 starts the transition. Now, here's the problem. They haven't defined what transition actually means in very clear metrics in a sense. There's a goal that was stated at the international conference last fall. Hand over security responsibilities to Afghans by 2014. Between that goal and where we're at right now are a whole range of other things that actually are ill-defined by people I know inside the government who don't know how to define certain key metrics on the security, governance, and economic development front. Hence the need for things like the Ike Skelton Act that demands a report from the administration. So yes, we're in a period of change. We need the change. There's an impulse that's out there. It's recognized on the inside. So certainly, yes, there's change. Second, on counterinsurgency, I mean, look, there's a certain view that we're actually not doing counterinsurgency in Afghanistan if you look at it from its textbook sort of application. And nor could we ever really do it in a country like Afghanistan. We don't have the force levels that are required of doing that. And then, you know, one thing I would stress also, if we were doing it and we were measuring it by the key metric of counterinsurgency, which is population protection, the people are safe. 2010 turns out to be the deadliest year for the Afghan people compared to all of the other years we've been there. Now, I should note that the vast majority of those deaths are at the hands of the insurgency. But part of the problem, I think, and I would close and answer your question, Susan, is the question of sustainability in a period of transition and what we leave behind is a question that remains unanswered because of the problems that have been identified from the get-go at the start of the Obama administration and well before it. Pakistan and weak governance and corruption and partners in the Afghan government. Write the history of what the McChrystal surge and what was decided in 2009 to 2010. It all depends on how things end up. But if you knew going in that those were weak pillars and that they needed to be integrated, then why commit the resources to clear areas, as President Obama said, don't clear areas that you can't hold and that you can't transition. I'm afraid we've done that. And now the question is, now what? Some people, you know, counterinsurgency theorists would like you to say, okay, we've made these gains, so we don't want to lose those gains over the last year and a half. Certainly there's been security gains in the southern part of Afghanistan. But it gets us into this self-perpetuating cycle that when you step back to the strategic level that Richard wants you to get at, you really lose sight of what the hell we're doing. And I think, yes, we're moving through a change, but we need greater clarity of purpose of what we're actually trying to get done beyond disrupt, dismantle, defeat al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Ambassador Thomas, do you think we're just talking about talking at this point, or you know, do we need to have a whole new Washington process in order to be able to have a serious political conversation?
Well, I mean, I think that Contrary to Brian, I mean, I think the administration's intentions are fairly clear. Brian has called for a clearer strategy, which should also be more ambiguous. I'm not sure how we quite achieve both aspects of that. But I mean, the administration has set out the broad objective, which I've already talked about, which is a fairly simple one, which is denying Afghanistan as a sanctuary and an ally with international terrorists. It's said it's going to begin scaling back American combat forces with a view to turning full combat responsibility for combat over to the Afghans by 2014. It said it's prepared to stay beyond that in a military as well as a civilian capacity to provide non-combat assistance to Afghan forces. It's said in a speech that Secretary Clinton gave on February 18th at the Asia Society that it wants to begin a negotiation, that it has no preconditions for that negotiation, that its objectives of having the Taliban cut its ties with al-Qaeda, accept the Constitution, and lay down their arms are not preconditions, they're objectives for the negotiation itself. So, I mean, I think all of these things are easier to say than they are to carry out. I think they're particularly complicated in a multilateral setting, in a place as distant and inaccessible as Afghanistan. But I don't think there's any lack of clarity in what the administration hopes to achieve and the instruments that it's dedicated to achieving it.
Just quickly, strategic ambiguity. What
Yeah,
did you mean by
I
that?
think the comment is relevant in the chuckles it elicited because it demonstrates the problem with how we think about strategy. Because you can have a clear strategy which has ways and means and tactics that have flexibility built into them that demand more of others, of partners. And in fact, you know, we talked a little bit about Libya in the first panel, but I think this is also kind of what the Obama administration is trying to do. They have a clearly articulated goal of its strategy. I don't necessarily agree with it, but there's a flexibility in the strategy that's inherent, and it demands more of others. And we don't have that at this point. I think I would disagree. You know, I think if we are focusing on the disrupt, dismantle, defeat al-Qaeda, we've not answered that question that my boss, John Podesta, asked of Richard Holbrooke 2 summers ago. Of, well, then what does this mean in terms of what we need to leave behind? What is our stated end objectives? And if you look at all of the strategy documents, at least publicly, that are produced, it's really still unclear in Afghanistan in terms of what's the cost to completion and what are we going to demand of others. And then I think we're really at a loss when it comes to Pakistan.
Just quickly, Christine, I want you to weigh in, if you could, on negotiations. You said, well, some of the allies that we've been fighting with in Afghanistan or as bad or worse than the Taliban, quote unquote. Do you believe that some of arguments have been made here that there's no real partners for the U.S. in a meaningful negotiated settlement? Where do you come down on that?
Okay, I have to confess, with all the background, I heard about 1 in 3 words of what's been said in the last 10 minutes.
So tell us just quickly about your views on whether it's possible to negotiate with the Taliban right now.
Possible for whom to negotiate with the Taliban?
Well, good question. Who did you have in mind?
Well, look, I mean, everyone's negotiating with the Taliban. I mean, this isn't new. I mean, there have been discussions ongoing with different elements of the Taliban ever since the latter days of 2001 and the earlier days of 2002. So, I mean, it's absolutely possible because virtually everyone is doing it. Pakistan's doing it. Karzai has been doing it. We've made various efforts to do it. So I don't think the issue of negotiation is the issue. I think it's the terms of the negotiation. What are the expectations, how enforceable they are, and what's the symmetry of those expectations? And so I think it's entirely, it really is a question of what is the desired end state from this? I mean, for example, the Pakistanis, as I'm sure all of you know, have been very apprehensive about what some of the erstwhile Quetta Shura folks were trying to do vis-a-vis Karzai, and they were rapidly trying to undermine that, trying to put into place actors that would act on behalf of Pakistan's interests. So I think the problem is there's a lot of negotiation going on, but it's really happening in a way that is self-utility maximizing for those particular actors. And I think, and there's a good reason for that. Pakistan is going to have a very distinct set of equities because of geography. and the kinds of things that we would be interested in, sort of maximalist positions about, I mean, I hate to say this, but I've grown really frustrated with some of the gender and human rights issues. I mean, when no one has any rights, I'm not sure how we could be talking about protecting baseline women's rights. And I say that as a full ovulator. I'm frustrated with this tenor of the discussion.
Christine, thank you so much.
I think it's not a question of whether or not some kind of negotiations can go forward. Everyone's doing it. I think the issue is what's the basis of those discussions and what are the desired end states. And this is where all of Afghanistan's near and far our neighbors are sort of like the hyena hopping on the Afghanistan carcass, trying to secure. I think that is where some of the issues lie.
Thank you so much. I think that's an important point. I want to make sure we get time for questions. We have a very full house here today. We have a microphone here in the back. I'll ask you to stand up and identify yourself and keep it short so we can get as many as possible here. I think we have one in the back to start.
Thank you, Gary Thomas, VOA News. In 1992, the Mujahideen took Kabul. They deposed Najibullah, which of course led to the advent of the Taliban. And at that time, the international community washed its hands of Afghanistan, and the United States started enforcing the Pressler Amendment on Pakistan for its nuclear program. I'm wondering how much, guilt is playing, perhaps is the word, into the U.S. determination to, quote, get it right, as Peter alluded to, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and how much Pakistan's anger or residual distrust of the United States is also playing into this. How much does this affect the picture that's going on now? Is this still hanging on after all these years?
Yeah. Peter, that picks up on a point.
Actually, can I take this issue?
Sure, Christine.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. This Pressler Amendment is a canard. The folks that bring out this Pressler Amendment issue are absolutely not conversant with its history. We first sanctioned Pakistan for non-proliferation, for proliferation concerns in April of 1979. April, long before December 79. From the time that the U.S. decided it would arm Pakistan, it had to provide equipment to Pakistan based on a presidential. The 1985 Pressler Amendment was passed. The Pressler Amendment was passed not to punish Pakistan. In fact, the Pressler Amendment was negotiated with Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to allow us to arm them while they continued to proliferate. So Pakistan fully understood what the Pressler Amendment was about. It was a gentleman's agreement that we will arm you while you proliferate until we no longer need to arm you. So this has become an article of fact, a sort of ossified fiction, if you will, that is used to beat the United States up and to create this narrative that we are an unreliable partner. They had from April of 79 to the time we actually pulled the sanctions in 89 to appreciate what our policy was about. So this is not the basis of the U.S. Pakistan discord. They understood full well. The problem with the Pakistan-U.S. discord is that we will enter into these partnerships under the umbrella of a specific purpose. But Pakistan is signing up to the U.S., with the U.S. to serve its own purposes, which are not those that the U.S. had expected. That's the problem. This is true when it signed up with Cito Cento in 1955. It's true in 1979, and it was true today. They've joined up with us to pursue their own interests vis-a-vis India. And what will typically happen in these periods, it takes like 5 years before the Americans to figure out that we're not playing the same game. And that's kind of where we are right now. We understand where we are. We are trying to pretend that we have a strategic relationship when our strategic interests